Joined by Piers and, of course, Katie Balls, who is here to review the papers with us. Piers, it's been, what, 9 months since you were on television?
I haven't been on breakfast television for nearly a year. It feels sort of weird, but nice. And my one question for you is, am I allowed to have an opinion? Because that was the problem before.
You've come to tell us about the papers. And there is a lot for you. A perfect news storm day, I would say. A lot for you to get your teeth into. What are you going to start with?
Well, there's a common theme, isn't there, with all of the people in the news, whether it's Novak Djokovic, who's just been told he's going to be deported for breaking all sorts of rules. You have Boris Johnson, who doesn't believe the rules apply to him. You have Prince Andrew, who doesn't believe the rules apply to him. Prince Harry's popped his head up from California, again wanting to have his royal cake and eat it. So there's a common theme of people in powerful positions who basically want to have one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. And Djokovic, in a way, sums this up. He's the world's #1 tennis player. He's a fantastic athlete. But he's also become an iconic figure for the anti-vax brigade. He's also systematically, throughout this whole process, revealed himself to be someone who just doesn't abide by any conventional rules. He says he tested positive on December the 16th. There are question marks about that. But if he did, he was then seen breaching all the rules in Serbia and then in Marbella, where he flew to.
Turning up in photographs with children the next day.
Posing with people and breaking the rules and so on. And then he gets to Australia, where he's lied on his immigration form and so on. And the bottom line for Novak Djokovic, it doesn't matter how good you are at tennis or how rich and powerful you are. When it comes to the pandemic, we're all in this together or we're not. And he's just been told that D-Day for Djokovic means deportation back to Dubai. And I think it's the right decision. And I think it sends the right message, which is actually, no, sorry, the rules apply to everybody.
Katie, what about parties in number 10? Talking of rules, plenty of that in the papers today.
Yeah, I think the big question in politics this weekend is, will Boris Johnson cling on? In a way, it's a strange question to even ask if you think about that majority of 80 just 2 years ago. But things have really moved, in large because of the Partygate row. And Boris Johnson admitted this week that he did attend, perhaps for a short period, but did attend a drinks party in the 10 Downing Street garden when there were restrictions for the rest of the country. Now, Tim Shipman, I think in the Sunday Times, has a very illuminating piece which asks, is the lame duck Prime Minister finally sunk? And I think what's interesting about this piece, and there's a few parts, is Boris Johnson apologised this week in the Commons chamber, but increasingly MPs believe that that apology was quite limited. And Tim Shipman recounts a meeting Boris Johnson had with his team the day after that ITV email published the email about the event he went to. And he is ultimately asking his advisors how they got him into this mess and blaming them. And there is a sense that this Prime Minister, to get out of his current problems if he can, will oust members of his top team if he survives the Sue Gray report. And I think this is going to cause issues with his party if he looks like he isn't taking responsibility. The other quite interesting detail is the fact that Boris Johnson almost has a two-pronged strategy. So ousting lots of staff, not him, obviously, and then in the meantime embarking on Operation Red Meat to show to his Tory support base that, yes, he really is the right Tory Prime Minister still. So you see the BBC licence fee being frozen and other, I think, grassroots-friendly policies being planned, including levelling up, fleshing it out. Will it work? I think the jury's really out, and there's quite a few hurdles for the Prime Minister still.
Piers.
Well, I don't think the jury's out at all. The court of public opinion has come back and found him guilty of the most brazen, rank hypocrisy imaginable.
Have they really, the court of public opinion?
I think so.
That is your view, to be fair.
It's not. I don't think it's just my view. The polls suggest that his popularity is sinking to all-time lows. But it's not really about that. This really comes down, I think, to that one party. Forget all the others for a moment. The one party back in May 2020. This was the time when the entire country had been in lockdown for weeks on end. This was a time when you couldn't go and see loved ones when they were dying in hospital from this virus. This was a time when, on that day that they had this party, Oliver Dowden, the government minister, who you've got coming on, and it'll be interesting to see what he says about this, but literally minutes after he has the brass neck to stand there at the Downing Street press conference and order everybody, you're allowed to only meet one person outside at 2 metre distance from another household. I met my eldest son that day for the first time in 3 months at a 2 metre distance. I wasn't even able to shake hands with my son, but I had it on that scale of what was going on. I had a cousin who couldn't see his dying father. I had a great school friend who couldn't see her mother, who died in a care home from COVID, had to say goodbye on FaceTime, then had a funeral for a handful of people. I had a co-worker, Kate Garraway, at Good Morning Britain, who couldn't go and see her critically ill husband. All over the country, people had these kind of stories, and they were horrific stories of separation. And yet the very people who were telling the country to do this were having a massive knees up in Downing Street that night and carried on having knees ups throughout the entire pandemic. And it's a complete disgrace.
This does not mean that the Prime Minister will go, though, does it?
It doesn't mean he will go. It does mean he should go, because public trust in the government has surely been completely shattered. Now, the Conservative Party will decide whether he will continue as leader, but every Conservative MP must be looking at all these stories and concluding, surely, that confidence, public confidence, has been irrevocably destroyed by what's happened here. I can't think of a bigger breach, frankly, than a global health emergency where the government make these draconian orders and completely disregard them with impunity.
Katie, I mean, that's Piers' view. We're all
I'm not alone.
You're not alone. We are all waiting for Sue Gray and to find out what her report comes up with, its fact-finding mission. And meanwhile, the papers are still full of the runners and riders who could take over from the Prime Minister.
Yes, and I think the reason there's so much speculation over who could take over from the Prime Minister is one of the things that makes this particularly difficult for Boris Johnson is it's so much a Boris Johnson crisis. This is a scandal which is about his Downing Street. Yes, he may not be at every single party, but it's a top-down culture in Downing Street. And that means that MPs and ministers are starting to ask, if this really is as toxic as it currently seems to be in the polls, and that doesn't change in the coming weeks, is the best way to stop it being a permanent Conservative crisis to change leader. I think, though, this Telegraph spread, which puts out very visually the various runners and riders, also points to part of the reason Boris Johnson might not be pushed out just yet. There is no consensus on who will take over from Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is seen as the favourite. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, also. But both have critics. There's plenty of MPs saying that they don't want Liz Truss to be Prime Minister. They'd rather Boris Johnson, similar to Rishi Sunak. And you have the odds of, some newer MPs, the Education Secretary, Nadine Zahouri is being mentioned.
Oh, apology, we have a problem on the line there. But
Piers, let me just... The risk of the unknown is one of the things keeping Boris Johnson a little bit safer than he might not be.
Well, he might be safe, but he's completely damaged, rather like a ship that's been
Can I just ask you, Piers, about, I mean, James Slack, who it was his leaving do on the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. He was working in Downing Street at the time, head of communications there. He's now gone to The Sun. Is that partly, I mean, he obviously knew exactly what was going on. We've only just found out about it. Is that partly, you work for The Sun now, is that partly why The Sun is not covering, I mean...
I don't know.
Zayn on the front page.
Well, they've been covering these stories.
Perhaps not as prominently as other newspapers.
Well, you'd have to ask The Sun about that. I've just joined as a columnist. What I would say is he's come out and very emphatically in a statement said it shouldn't have happened. And he's been very contrite about that. And that's the right thing to do. And there will be lots of staffers, I think, who will be feeling that way. But the rot comes from the top. If the Prime Minister... whose home is number 10 Downing Street, is attending these parties and glad-handing people, as was reported, then that, to me, is the more significant part of this scandal, and that is the one that has to be made accountable, not just to every minister, but to every Tory MP right now. They've got to ask themselves with their conscience.
Let's have a look at the Mirror as well. You've got another story there, how they're covering it this morning.
Well, it's a bridge too far is the headline. Well, fridge too far, yeah. I mean, Boris Johnson ran into a fridge to hide from me on Good Morning Britain once, so fridges are quite uppermost, I'm sure, in his mind. But they actually brought in a fridge to have their Friday night drinkies. But bear in mind, again, that wouldn't normally matter. This matters because they were ordering the rest of the country that they couldn't do this kind of thing. It's the hypocrisy and the brazen double standards which I think is really cutting through to the British public. And whether you like Boris or not, personally, I've always rather liked the guy. But all the things that, I wrote in my first Sun column last week, all the things that people voted for him for, the kind of shambolic style, the rebellious style, the not a normal politician style, they're now all sticks to beat him with, because it turns out in a global pandemic, they're not the qualities you want in a leader.
Let's move on to the royal family, because there are stories about both Prince Andrew and Prince Harry. Katie, you start with Prince Andrew.
Yes, so the Mirror reports on how Prince Andrew could fight this civil action against him in America, which we now know will go ahead despite efforts by Prince Andrew to stop this. We know that he's going to fight as a private citizen, and it says Andrew, this is the headline, could not remember Virginia, and now he's accusing her of having false memory syndrome. Now, false memory syndrome is something that Ghislaine Maxwell used in her defence in her trial, which is the link to this. And it clearly was not successful because she was found guilty on several counts. And therefore, I think the big issue for Boris, the big issue really here, when you're looking at how Andrew could fight this, is there is a photo. There's a photo that puts him there. And I think that that is going to be much harder when it says to who has the false memory. And ultimately, what is this going to do to the Queen on a Jubilee year? It's already quite embarrassing for the royal family. And I think you can see that in how he has been stripped of various titles in the past week.
And let's talk about Prince Harry as well, because he is also in the papers this morning. This is about his protection, his security when he comes to the UK.
Well, it's another example. I mean, it was absolutely chillingly inevitable that these two would pop their heads up again right when the Queen least wants them to. I feel so sorry for the Queen right now. It's her Platinum Jubilee coming.
Tell us what the story is, then.
Well, I'm just going to lead up to this because I think the timing of it is so appalling as well. She's lost her husband. She's got this awful situation with Andrew. And now her grandson, who's been baiting the royal family and the monarchy all year, has now popped up from his mansion in California to say that when he comes back to the UK, he wants to have the British police protect him. Well, sorry, mate, that's not how this works.
But he's offering to pay for it.
I don't give a damn if he's going to pay for it or not.
Just to be very clear, he's not saying that he wants the taxpayer to fund his security. He is saying he wants the British police to protect him when he's here, and he will pay for it.
Fine. Why should the British police protect him? He's now a private citizen. He doesn't do any royal duties. They're making hundreds of millions.
He's a high-profile private citizen.
They're making hundreds of millions of dollars, fleecing their royal titles, which they still have, while simultaneously trashing the royal family and the institution of the monarchy that his grandmother is the head of. And now they want to have their cake and eat it as always and say, when we're back in the country, we want to be treated like other royals. You're not other royals. In fact, I wouldn't let them have the royal titles. I think there's, again, a brazen double standard. If you want to have the royal titles, do royal duty, like your grandmother, who is the pillar of royal duty.
Let's talk to Katie now. We haven't mentioned the word COVID yet. Well, not really. COVID restrictions may be lifted, says the Mail.
Yes, and we know that the current Plan B restrictions expire at the end of the month, and we're now expecting, the government hope is to announce an end to all Plan B restrictions, with the exemption that masks would stay, we expect, on public transport and also in shops. And I think that this is pretty good news in the sense Omicron was not what we were warned by Sage it could be if you look around Christmas time. But it also points to the fact that Boris Johnson, in a different universe where there weren't parties, I think could be winning some points right now from his MPs and voters for this, but it has been overshadowed. OK,
Katie, and Piers, I'm just going to ask you one more question about yourself, your new show, because you are back here on television. We haven't seen you for a very long time. What are you actually going to be doing? Well,
I'm launching a new global daily TV show for Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and Fox America, starting in the spring. It'll air daily in the UK, daily in the US, and in Australia daily as well. So I'll be a tri-continental irritant, which is something I've been aspiring to be for quite some time. But no, it's going to be opinion, debate, big interviews. So if you've missed me on morning TV, I'm sorry, but I'll be back very soon. If you haven't missed me, I'm not sorry.
Piers Morgan, lovely to see you. Katie Balls, lovely to see you too. Thank you both very much for joining me this morning.
By the way, you should get the job full time. It's great at this.